Somewhere in Los Angeles, in the cold January light of 1947, a woman is walking through a vacant lot. She is not walking. She has been placed there. Her name is Elizabeth Short. She is 22 years old. She will never be known by that name again. There are no tire tracks in the surrounding grass. No footprints. No blood. Whatever happened to her happened somewhere else. Somewhere private, somewhere deliberate. And whoever carried her to this empty lot on South Norton Avenue had the patience to wipe her clean. To pose her. To arrange her in the pale winter grass as though she were meant to be found. That morning, January 15, 1947, a woman named Betty Berzinger was pushing her 3-year-old daughter in a stroller through the Leimert Park neighborhood of South Los Angeles. The neighborhood was quiet, residential, the kind of street where people hung laundry and swept their front steps. She glanced toward the vacant lot beside her. She thought it was a mannequin at first. It took her a moment, a single, irreversible moment, to understand that it was not. What Betty Berzinger saw that morning, in that quiet neighborhood, under that pale winter sky, would never leave her. And what it set in motion, the investigation, the obsession, the mythology, the grief, would never end. 77 years have passed. No one has ever been charged. No one has ever been convicted. The case file is still open. This is the story of Elizabeth Short. Not the Black Dahlia. Not the legend. Not the symbol that post-war America made of her. The woman. To understand what happened to Elizabeth Short, you have to understand the world she was trying to survive in. Los Angeles in 1947 was a city wearing two faces at once. The war was over. The boys had come home. The economy was roaring back to life, and Hollywood was at the center of it all. Glamorous, loud, intoxicating, and completely indifferent to the thousands of young men and women who arrived every year with nothing but a dream and a bus ticket. The city had expanded enormously during the war years. Defense workers, military personnel, drifters, and dreamers had flooded in from every corner of the country. The population had swollen past 2 million. New neighborhoods were going up. New nightclubs were opening. The film industry was producing more movies than at any point in its history, and the mythology of stardom, the idea that an ordinary person could walk off a street corner and into a film studio and emerge famous, had seeped into the American imagination like a drug. But beneath the surface of Hollywood Boulevard and Sunset Strip, beneath the neon and the studio gates and the gossip columns, there was another Los Angeles, a city of rooming houses and cheap cafes, of young women working waitressing jobs and sending letters home that made everything sound better than it was, a city where the gap between the dream and the reality was immense, and where that gap produced its own particular kind of loneliness. Elizabeth Short had been trying to close that gap for years. She was born on July 29, 1924, in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters to Cleo Short and his wife, Phoebe. The family briefly moved to Portland, Maine, before settling in Medford, a quiet suburb north of Boston. By any measure, her early childhood was ordinary. Her father built miniature golf courses. Her mother raised the children. The neighborhood was unremarkable. Then 1929 arrived. The stock market crash wiped out most of what Cleo Short had built. Within a year, he was gone. His car was found abandoned on the Charlestown Bridge, and the family assumed he had jumped into the Charles River below. There was no body. There was no note. There was only the empty space where a father had been. Elizabeth Short was 5 years old. Phoebe Short sold the house and moved her 5 daughters into a small apartment in Medford. She found work as a bookkeeper. The family managed, in the way that working-class families during the Depression managed, carefully, quietly, without complaint. But the absence of Cleo Short left a mark on Elizabeth that those who knew her later in life could recognize clearly, even if they couldn't name it. A restlessness, a longing for stability that coexisted, uneasily, with an inability to stay still. Elizabeth was a sickly child. She suffered from severe asthma and bronchitis, and when she was 15 she required lung surgery. Her doctors recommended she spend winters in warmer climates. This practical medical reality gave her a reason, or a permission, to keep moving. She spent winters in Florida and returned to Medford in the summers. She dropped in and out of high school. She floated. In 1942, she discovered that her father was alive. Cleo Short had not jumped. He had simply disappeared, started over in California, reinvented himself, taken a job at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard near Vallejo, north of San Francisco. He had, in the most straightforward terms, abandoned his family and chosen a different life. When Elizabeth learned this, she traveled to California to find him. She was 18. She did not go in anger. She went, it seems, in hope. It did not work. They argued. Cleo Short was not prepared to resume the role of father, and Elizabeth was not prepared to pretend that the years of absence hadn't happened. She left his house and found work at Camp Cook, a military base near Lompoc on the California coast, in the Post Exchange. She made friends. She dated. She moved on. There is something important to understand about Elizabeth Short in these years. She was charming. Genuinely, effortlessly charming in a way that people remembered. She was pretty, with dark hair and pale skin and green eyes, and she knew how to carry herself in a room. She liked movies with an intensity that went beyond entertainment. She studied them, memorized them, modeled herself on the actresses she admired. She told people she was going to be in pictures. She said it with enough conviction that people believed her, or wanted to. In September 1943, she was arrested in Santa Barbara for underage drinking at a local bar. The officer who processed her felt sorry for her and arranged for her to be sent back to Massachusetts. She did not go back to Massachusetts. She went to Florida instead. In Florida, she met Major Matthew Michael Gordon Jr., a decorated Army Air Force officer preparing for deployment to the India-Burma theater. They fell in love, or something that felt enough like love that it mattered. Gordon proposed by letter while recovering from injuries after a crash in India. She accepted. Then, on August 10, 1945, Gordon was killed in a second crash. The war was almost over. The man she had planned to marry was gone. She was 21 years old and had already lost more than most people lose in a lifetime. She came back to California in the summer of 1946. Los Angeles this time, the city itself, not the suburbs, not the military bases. Hollywood. She moved into a room behind the Florentine Gardens nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard. She waitressed. She went to clubs. She wrote letters home that made everything sound fine. She went to auditions, or said she did. There were no acting credits, no studio contracts, no callbacks that led anywhere. What is documented, clearly and without dispute, is that by December 1946 she was in San Diego, staying with friends, running low on money. That is where she met Robert Manley, a married salesman who went by the nickname Red. He drove her back to Los Angeles in early January 1947. On January 9th, he dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel on Pershing Square in downtown Los Angeles, where she told him she was going to meet her sister. Employees at the Biltmore would later remember seeing her in the lobby, making phone calls. Then she walked out the door onto Olive Street, turned south, and disappeared into the fog. She was seen alive for 6 more days. Scattered sightings in downtown Los Angeles and Hollywood, documented in official LAPD reports, But none of these accounts led to a clear picture of where she went or who she was with. On the morning of January 15th, Betty Berzinger found her in the vacant lot on Norton Avenue. The first officers arrived at the scene at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning. What they found, and what the Los Angeles Examiner photographer captured on film within hours, was so methodically disturbing that it would alter the trajectory of American true crime journalism forever. The body had been completely drained of blood. Not mostly drained. Completely. The skin had been washed, scrubbed, and posed, laid out with a precision that suggested not frenzy but deliberateness. There was not a single drop of blood at the scene. The ground beneath the body was dry. The body had been bisected at the waist, cut cleanly in two, and the two halves had been placed parallel to one another in the grass, a few feet from the sidewalk, close enough that a passerby would inevitably see them. The cuts were precise. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy the following day noted the skill evident in the bisection. The technique was clean, suggesting anatomical knowledge. This detail would drive one of the central theories of the investigation for years, that the killer had medical training, possibly surgical experience. The official cause of death, as determined by the autopsy, was cerebral hemorrhage and shock caused by lacerations to the face. The injuries to her face, including the cuts extending from the corners of her mouth, were perimortem, meaning they occurred at or around the time of death. The autopsy also confirmed evidence of prolonged restraint and torture. Elizabeth Short had not died quickly. Identification took approximately 56 hours. The FBI matched fingerprints taken from her 1943 arrest record within an hour of receiving them via a primitive fax machine called a sound photo, loaned by the Los Angeles Examiner. By the evening of January 16th, the LAPD knew her name. A phone call was placed to her mother in Massachusetts. The Examiner was listening in on that call, a detail that tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between the Los Angeles press and the investigation that followed. The nickname Black Dahlia emerged in the days after the identification. Its exact origin is disputed, but it is generally understood to have been coined by reporters at the Herald Express, possibly inspired by the 1946 film noir The Blue Dahlia, and it caught on because of her dark hair, her preference for black clothing, and the irresistible quality of the name itself. It was the kind of nickname that turned a murder victim into a headline. That transformation, from Elizabeth Short, a young woman from Medford, Massachusetts, to the Black Dahlia, a figure of noir mythology, happened within days. And it would never be reversed. The investigation that followed was, by any reasonable measure, staggering in scale and catastrophically ineffective in outcome. At its peak, approximately 750 investigators from the LAPD and other agencies were assigned to the case, including 400 sheriff's deputies and 250 California State Patrol officers. A $10,000 reward was posted by a city councilman. The Examiner ran the case as front-page news for 35 consecutive days. Reporters were embedded in the investigation. Tips flooded in. Within months, the LAPD had generated over 150 named suspects. None of them were ever charged. The early stages of the investigation focused on Robert "Red" Manley, the last confirmed person to have seen Elizabeth Short alive. He was arrested on January 19th, 4 days after the body was found, and questioned extensively. He cooperated fully, submitted to a polygraph, and was released the following day. Investigators never considered him a serious long-term suspect. On January 24th, postal inspectors intercepted an envelope addressed to the Los Angeles newspapers. Inside were items that had belonged to Elizabeth Short: her address book, some personal papers, and a note constructed from cut and pasted newspaper headlines that read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." The address book had been cleaned with gasoline, destroying any fingerprints. Subsequent letters arrived over the following weeks, some of them addressed to the police, some to the newspapers. They were all constructed the same way: cut out letters and words, assembled into fragmentary, taunting messages. Whether these letters were genuinely from the killer has never been established. The LAPD took them seriously enough to investigate, but handwriting analysis was inconclusive, and the cut-and-paste format made authentication impossible. What the letters did accomplish was feed the newspapers. The Examiner published them. The Herald Express published them. Competing papers ran competing theories. The line between journalism and investigation had effectively dissolved. Lead Detective Sergeant Finus Brown would later blame the press directly for compromising the case, for publishing details that contaminated witness testimony, for publicizing forensic specifics that enabled false confessions, and for creating a public frenzy that made dispassionate investigation nearly impossible. The false confessions numbered over 30. They began arriving in late January 1947, within 2 weeks of the murder, and continued for years. They came from women and men, from veterans and drifters, from people seeking attention and people, apparently, seeking punishment. The first was a woman named Minnie Sepulveda, who called a police station from a bar. She was dismissed within hours. The first demonstrably false male confession came from an Army veteran named Daniel Voorhees on January 28th. He was released when his alibi held. For every hour detectives spent on a credible lead, they spent 3 hours on a bad one. By spring of 1947, the case had gone cold. The investigation continued in fits and starts for years afterward. A 1949 grand jury examined the handling of the case and concluded that it remained unsolved due to insufficient evidence, not because of police misconduct, though allegations of misconduct circulated anyway. The LAPD was under scrutiny during that same period for separate corruption scandals involving payments to police from a brothel operator, and this climate of institutional distrust colored how the public interpreted the Dahlia investigation. In 1949, a new lead emerged when a man named Leslie Dillon, then living in Florida, contacted the police department to suggest an acquaintance might be responsible. LAPD psychiatrist Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver, working outside normal investigative protocols, lured Dillon back to Los Angeles and had him detained without proper legal process in an attempt to extract a confession. Dillon managed to smuggle a note out of his detention, exposing what amounted to an illegal kidnapping. The LAPD's handling of the Dillon situation became a scandal of its own, prompting a lawsuit. Dillon was eventually cleared. The suspects accumulated over the decades. In 2003, former LAPD detective Steve Hodel published a book arguing that his own father, Dr. George Hill Hodel, was responsible, citing the medical precision evident in the crime, his father's documented sexual behavior, and circumstantial evidence gathered over years of private investigation. The theory attracted serious attention and significant critique. Larry Harnish, a Los Angeles Times researcher who spent decades studying the case, disputed elements of Hodel's analysis. Other researchers proposed other names. A 2017 book by British author Peyu Eat-Well revisited the evidence around Leslie Dillon and suggested the possibility of a cover-up. None of these theories have been proven. None of them have been definitively disproven. The case file remains open. What is not disputed is this: whoever killed Elizabeth Short had access to a private space large enough to hold someone for an extended period, possessed anatomical knowledge sufficient to perform a precise bisection, had the means to transport a body across Los Angeles without detection, and had the composure to clean the body thoroughly, pose it carefully, and leave without being seen. These are not the characteristics of impulse. They are the characteristics of preparation. Here is what tends to be forgotten when people discuss the Black Dahlia. There was a woman. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She liked movies. She wore black dresses. She sent letters home. She was funny, according to people who knew her. Genuinely funny, with a quick laugh and a way of telling stories that made people want to keep listening. She had a tendency to embroider her own biography, to make things sound more exciting than they were, which is a recognizable human behavior, and not an unusual one in a city built on fantasy. She borrowed money and sometimes didn't pay it back. She was generous with her time and attention. She dated widely, as young women in cities tend to do. She was not, as the newspapers immediately characterized her, a femme fatale. She had no acting credits. She was not a starlet. She was a 22-year-old woman with respiratory problems and a complicated family history who was trying to make something work in a city that made nothing easy. The press did something to Elizabeth Short that it has done to female victims throughout modern history. It transformed her. Within days of the discovery of her body, the Examiner and Herald Express had constructed a narrative around her that emphasized her physical appearance, her social life, and, with insinuation if not explicit accusation, her sexual history. Reporters contacted men she had dated and published their descriptions of her. They emphasized the mystery of her movements in her final weeks in a way that suggested she had been doing something clandestine, something she deserved to keep secret. The word promiscuous appears in early coverage without any substantiation. The phrase wayward girl appears. The implication, barely concealed beneath the breathless prose, was that a young woman who moved around a lot and dated several men had somehow contributed to her own fate. This was 1947. This is how the press operated. It is not a marginal or cynical reading of the coverage. It is the coverage, documented and archived, examined and condemned by subsequent historians and journalists for decades. The Los Angeles Examiner and its competitor papers were running a circulation war, and a brutally murdered young woman with a cinematic nickname was raw material for that war. The detective assigned as lead investigator, Captain Jack Donahue, told the press in public statements that he believed the murder had taken place in a remote building or shack on the outskirts of Los Angeles, and that the body had been transported to the scene afterward. This assessment was based on the absence of blood, the scrubbed condition of the body, and the precision of the injuries. That assessment has generally been supported by subsequent analysis. But beyond it, the LAPD had little that held together. What grew in the absence of resolution was mythology. Elizabeth Short became something larger than herself, a figure that absorbed the anxieties and projections of post-war America. She represented the dark side of the Hollywood dream. She represented the danger that the city posed to young women alone. She represented the violence that lurked beneath the chrome and glamour of the post-war boom. She became a symbol before anyone had actually tried to understand her as a person. Her mother, Phoebe, learned of her daughter's death from a phone call at which a newspaper reporter was essentially present. She was never given adequate space to grieve in private, because the press did not allow privacy. The spectacle consumed everything. What Phoebe Short understood, what her surviving daughters understood, was that the person the newspapers called the Black Dahlia bore only a partial resemblance to the person they had known. The mythology had already begun to replace the woman before Elizabeth Short was even buried. She was interred at Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California, on January 25, 1947. Her grave exists. Her name is on the stone. The question that haunts this case is not simply, who did it? The question that haunts this case is what it means that we still don't know. Over 75 years of investigation, theory, confession, accusation, and re-examination have produced no verdict, no arrest, no proven answer. The LAPD's original investigative failures, the contaminated press access, the mishandled leads, the institutional dysfunction exposed by the 1949 grand jury, foreclosed certain avenues of inquiry that might have mattered. The false confessors muddied the water. The newspapers destroyed potential witnesses by publishing information that should have been held back. But there is something else at work in the longevity of this case beyond investigative failure. There is something in American culture that has found the Black Dahlia impossible to release. The case has generated books, films, television series, academic papers, podcasts, and countless hours of online speculation. James Ellroy, who lost his own mother to an unsolved murder when he was 10 years old, wrote one of his most celebrated novels about the case. Director Brian De Palma adapted it. The case is referenced in history courses and journalism schools. It has never left the cultural foreground. Why? The honest answer may be uncomfortable. The case endures partly because Elizabeth Short was young and beautiful, and her death was spectacular. It endures because it happened in Hollywood, the city of images, the city of glamour, and that contrast between setting and horror is irresistible. It endures because it was never solved, and unsolved cases invite projection. They become containers for everything we want to think about violence, and women, and cities, and desire and power. But it also endures because it is real. The vacant lot on Norton Avenue exists. The LAPD case files exist. The photographs exist. The letters exist. The fingerprint record from 1943 exists, taken when a police officer in Santa Barbara felt sorry for a young woman and sent her back to Massachusetts instead of charging her with anything. Elizabeth Short is buried in Oakland. Her sisters, Virginia, Dorothea, Elnora, Muriel, were real people who lived real lives after losing her. Her mother, Phoebe, lived until 1992, 45 years after the phone call that told her what had happened in that vacant lot. 45 years of knowing that whoever did this was never found. The case did produce one concrete legislative consequence. Within weeks of Elizabeth Short's murder, California Republican State Assemblyman C. Don Field introduced a bill calling for the formation of a sex offender registry. California became the first state in the country to make sex offender registration mandatory. That law exists today. It affects millions of people. A dead 22-year-old woman from Medford, Massachusetts, changed the legal landscape of the United States. Her name is not usually attached to that legacy. The name that is attached to her, the name she never chose and never knew, is a noir epithet coined by tabloid reporters competing for circulation. It is a beautiful name, as names go, dark and cinematic, precisely suited to the Los Angeles of 1947. But it is not her name. Her name was Elizabeth. She was 22 years old. She had green eyes. She liked the movies. She wanted to be somebody. She was already somebody. And somewhere in Los Angeles, in January of 1947, somebody took that from her. Deliberately, carefully, with knowledge and time and privacy enough to do it completely, and then set her down in the winter grass of an empty lot and walked away. They have never been found. The grass has long since been built over. The lot is a neighborhood now. The city has grown past it and around it and over it, the way cities do. But the question remains, exactly where they left it. In the silence. In the cold January light. Unanswered. Based on documented LAPD records, FBI case files, archived Los Angeles newspaper reports from January, February 1947, the 1949 Los Angeles grand jury findings, and the work of historians and researchers, including those cited in John Douglas and Mark Olshaker's The Cases That Haunt Us. All factual claims are drawn from verified historical sources. Theories are presented as theories. The murder of Elizabeth Short remains officially unsolved.